All right, so the resolution we're going to be discussing today is the United States should pull out from the nuclear deal with Iran. I think the words in the resolution are pretty self-explanatory, so I'm going to go ahead and jump right into the argumentation for today's round. I'm going to begin by discussing why the deal doesn't work, and then secondarily, we're going to be talking about some justifications for why we need to pull out from the deal. So in way of background, the Obama administration created the Iran nuclear deal to hinder Iran's nuclear development program. We did not want them to acquire weapons of mass destruction. And so we're going to examine 4 unique pieces of evidence to illustrate why that original deal has failed to do so. The first piece of evidence comes from the Foreign Policy Institute. And they found that Iran has repeatedly exceeded its allotment of what's called heavy water. Now, I'm no physicist, but apparently heavy water is a chemical element that's critically important to the development of weapons-grade plutonium, something we did not want Iran to have. The second piece of evidence is an intelligence report from the state of Hamburg in Germany. The report says, quote, "We find no evidence of an about-face in Iran's atomic policy," end quotes, meaning that after the deal, they see no evidence of Iran completely changing how they feel about nuclear weapons. In fact, the same report found that Iran was still sinking missile carrier technology during the deal. The third piece of evidence comes from the National Council of Resistance of Iran, and they found 2 things. The first is that Iran has repeatedly exceeded its ownership of advanced centrifuges, apparently another element critical to developing nuclear weapons. Additionally, the same report found that Iran is cooperating on missile development with the Democratic People's Republic of North Korea, and Iranian officials have been present at least 3 North Korean nuclear missile tests. The fourth piece of evidence comes from the International Atomic Energy Agency, a group that apparently was in charge of ensuring the deal was cooperated with on the Iranian side. They found that they could not verify that Iran was fully complying with the deal. And why is that? Well, apparently it's because their inspectors were repeatedly denied access to research facilities and military locations in Iran. This evidence indicates the deal has failed. We are not preventing Iran from continuing to develop their nuclear program. In fact, they're doing it quite well on their own, which leads me to argue for the justifications for pulling out of the deal. The first justification is that it sends a message to our enemies. The Obama administration allowed Iran to walk all over us and to illustrate to other countries that we don't really mean what we say when we enter in treaties. By pulling out of the deal, we're letting our enemies know that if you do not comply with the deal will not work out. The second justification is that it restores leverage. The Iran nuclear deal prevented us from sanctioning Iran's economy, and if we pull out of the deal, we'll be able to reinstitute those sanctions and apply some pressure to the Iranian regime. The third justification is that it protects U.S. interests. In case it hasn't been clear so far, Iran hates us. Their leader, the current Ayatollah, calls us the Great Satan, and they want to kill us. And they're also helping arm Kim Jong-un, who's currently in charge of the regime over in North Korea, who also wants to kill us with nuclear weapons. So the indications here that the deal is failing, and then we have compelling reasons for pulling out, and therefore I support the resolution and urge an affirmative ballot.
All right. Hello, Chris. I'll just crack straight into some arguments as well. So the first thing to note, obviously, is that we seem to agree that the concern here is really about the moral character of Iran. It's not really about other things. It's actually, and there's a good reason for that, is that nuclear proliferation really is the most political stage. It's the greatest existential threat. It fundamentally interferes with all other diplomatic efforts. So the question really is, is Iran more or less likely to be able to get a nuke with the deal in place or without the deal in place? You've given me a few reasons as to why you think the deal is failing. I think most of these are actually just factually incorrect. So the first 3 sources you give me are all from American think tanks, or one of them's name is even the Resistance Against Iran. These are not actors who have any special expertise or access to any Iranian site, so they're completely unqualified as to whether their assessments of Iran is complying with the deal, and also have politically vested interest in making it look like Iran is not. The only actor who I would be inclined to believe here is the last one you mentioned, which is the International Atomic Energy Agency, which is actually the agency put in charge of inspecting Iran's deals. But I don't know where you've got this idea that they've said that they've been denied access, because just simply look up on Google, for example, is Iran complying with the deal? And all of the headlines are that the International Atomic Energy Agency has repeatedly cleared them. For example, there hasn't been a single congressional vote in America which has said that America, or in any of the EU partners, which says that Iran isn't complying with the deal. So I think you've just been misinformed there. Iran is complying with its end of the deal. So that cracks me into my first point of substantive. What do we lose when we get out of this deal? Currently, Iran is limited to how many centrifuges it can build, which slows its ability to enrich uranium. It's secondly, limited as to how rich the uranium can be. To give you some brief numbers, they're limited to about 3% enrichment. Medical grade requires 20 and weapons requires 90. So it's really, really far away. The only grade they can enrich to is for energy purposes. The last thing is that Iran is subject to inspections by the International Atomic Energy Agency. They can inspect any of the known sites without notice at any time. And from other military sites, which are not at the moment designated nuclear sites, Iran can appeal those, but they can appeal to a board which the EU and the US has stacked its allies on, so they will never win an appeal, which leads to at most a delay of 24 days, which is insufficient to hide any serious nuclear program. What does this mean? Under the deal, we have a lot of limits as to what Iran can do, which means it can never get close to a nuclear weapon. And we also have the ability to ensure accountability on those limits via unprecedented ability to inspect. And if we pull out of the deal, we lose all of that. So even under the best case view, say my facts are wrong and Iran isn't complying with the deal, to scuttle the deal means that they aren't complying with the deal either, and we don't know about it. So even in the worst case, if Iran is not complying with the deal, it's still better to have the deal in place so we have the inspections available to see it and react accordingly. I'll pass the mic.
Okay, so I want to begin by defending the integrity of my evidence. So I cited 4 individual pieces of evidence from 4 unique sources. The first piece of evidence is from the Foreign Policy Institute. You're correct that this is an American think tank, but just because it's an American think tank doesn't mean it's unqualified. And as far as American think tanks go, you would be hard-pressed to find one more credible with a better reputation than the Foreign Policy Institute. Furthermore, the evidence from them simply said that Iran exceeded its allotment of heavy water. That is a well-documented fact. The Obama administration even purchased the excess heavy water from Iran, so it would look like that they were in compliance with the deal. That evidence of Iran exceeding its allotment is cited in pretty much every major news network. That there's nothing wrong with that piece of evidence. The second piece of evidence I cited was an intelligence report from Germany, who was also a party to the original negotiations in the Iran nuclear deal. And that evidence said that they found that German intelligence does not see Iran seriously changing face. And in other words, they didn't suddenly turn around and say, we don't want nukes anymore. The second thing that evidence says is that German intelligence found that they were still seeking missile carrier technology. And if you're interested, I will post that evidence in the comment section below. That's also very credible evidence. My third piece of evidence, you're correct, is from the National Council on Resistance to Iran. That's an American think tank. I see no reason to doubt their credibility for 2 reasons. The first is that the only thing they talked about in that piece of evidence was that Iran had exceeded the number of advanced centrifuges. I found that corroborated across multiple sources in my research time. The second thing that evidence said is that Iran is cooperating on missile development with North Korea. Again, that particular piece of evidence I found in multiple mainstream news outlets. The last piece of evidence is from the International Atomic Energy Agency. So this is very important. I'd like the judges to pay close attention to this. This last piece of evidence is from the international organization that is supposed to be monitoring Iran and inspecting them and ensuring that they are complying with the deal. This is a report directly from them that states that they could not verify that Iran was fully complying with the deal when it was passed. The other thing that piece of evidence says is that they repeatedly denied their inspectors access to research facilities and military locations. That is clear-cut evidence that we are not seeing compliance from Iran under the deal. So those were responses to my evidence. Now, my opponent basically made 2 arguments against my case. He says that we're going to lose our limits on Iran, and we're also going to lose accountability with them if we pull out from the deal. So in response to the idea that we're losing limits, I think it's obvious that Iran is not complying with the limits. We don't stand to lose much here. They're blatantly violating the terms of their agreement. But in terms of losing accountability, we see the exact same thing. Iran's not being accountable. In fact, according to the evidence from the agency that is in charge of Iran's accountability, they're not complying with them. So we actually don't stand to lose anything by pulling out of the deal. However, if you refer to my second argument, where I talked about how we're going to restore leverage, we have something to gain by pulling out, because by pulling out, we can re-sanction the Iranian economy and actually apply some pressure to them to ensure that they will comply in the future if we choose to renegotiate.
Okay, so I've had a bit of time to research some of the claims, and I actually think that upon further inspection, there are examples of the deal working. So let's start with the first one by the Foreign Policy Institute, that Iran exceeded its heavy water allotment. This is true, and if you just look it up, it wasn't even hidden by Iran. This was actually an example of the deal working, because Iran exceeded its allotment, made no effort to hide it, and once it was revealed by an inspection, as you said in your speech, Obama bought it back, right? So the Iran made efforts to comply with the end of the deal, that when its allotment of heavy water was exceeded, and it's pretty easy to understand why this might happen by mistake, right? Like if you've got multiple heavy water facilities and they all up at the same time, then maybe you'll exceed a specific allotment. But the more important thing is to ask, how does the deal interact with this? Because with no deal at all, which is what you're proposing, right, that allotment would be exceeded and we could do nothing about it. We wouldn't know that it would be exceeded and there was no ability for us to take it back. But under the deal, the allotment was ceded because of inspections, and then it was sold to the US so that the allotment was no longer exceeded, which means this is an example of the deal working. The German source seems to be very weird. It's like Iran's not changing face enough. Like there's nothing in the deal about Iran like changing face or changing, like I don't know, it's domestic political posturings. So this just to me seems outside of the scope of the deal. Obviously, Iran will still, for its own domestic political posturing purposes, say nasty things about America. That's not really a concern in the debate. We're more concerned about the restriction of nuclear weapons. Likewise, you said other things about seeking other military stuff like missiles. Well, they need missiles for other military purposes, which aren't nukes. Likewise, cooperating North Korea wasn't in the deal, so we can hardly hold it against them for violating something which was not in the deal. Last thing you said that the Atomic Energy Agency was denied access to sites. I really want to see this source. I know that they can be appealed from access to military sites which weren't specified in the deal, but again, that appeal process goes to a board which we are the majority of. I'm going to move on to a next argument now, which is credibility. I think it's very important to realize that, particularly when the US Congress has said that Iran has complied with the deal at every step of the way, for the US to of a deal like this without sufficient cause will ruin the US legitimacy on the world stage and will scuttle the attempts to make any other form of deal. I really want to know, for example, what you think Iran will do, what the alternative is, because at least we've got some restrictions now. Your alternative is no restrictions. And it also skulls the US's ability to make deals with many other countries, right? Because why would you engage in a deal with a country which routinely just pulls out of deals? And also the fact that this looks like it is political, because Trump has made it political domestically when he's talking about how he has to remove, for example, Obama's policies. It will particularly make it difficult, for example, late-term presidents or Democratic presidents to make the deals in this national stage, even when those deals are good, because the US will have gained itself a reputation of being an unreliable actor on the international stage, which probably has even far more reaching consequences than this deal. I'll pass the mic.
Okay, so I want to begin by talking about your responses to my evidence. We'll begin with this argument from the Foreign Policy Institute. So with respect to the heavy water, what we see here is an example of Obama covering for Iran. Iran did something that they weren't supposed to. You say that it's, oh, well, they just, they miscalculated with how much heavy water they have. Yeah, right. There's no way Iran miscalculated. What we're seeing here is probably an indication that they are developing something under the radar that they shouldn't be, which is why they developed too much heavy water. After all, they have said pretty clearly they do want to destroy America. So when Obama bought that heavy water back from Iran, he was covering for them. He was making it look like Iran was complying with the deal, when in reality they weren't. And again, that evidence is widespread. You can find that pretty easily. You consistently bring up this point that, if we don't have the deal, well, then what is our alternative? I want to make this very clear for the judges here. Our alternative is to sanction them. The deal took the teeth out of the State Department, because under the deal, we can no longer sanction Iran. However, if we pull out of the deal, we can reinstitute sanctions on Iran, which will allow us to starve their economy of resources it needs to run its nuclear program. One of the critical elements of the deal was because we can't sanction them anymore, there's nothing to prevent them from acquiring the materials and cash they need to run a successful nuclear weapons development program. However, if you vote for me, we have the ability to sanction them again, which would force them to come back to the negotiation table, and would also put us in a position where they would not be able to require nuclear weapons. Now, you go on to talk about U.S. credibility. You argue that pulling out of the deal would damage U.S. legitimacy. After all, why would you want to be engaged with a country that routinely pulls out of deals? I actually think that I'm actually going to turn this argument and say that pulling out of the deal is actually going to enhance our legitimacy. Because what we're going to do is we're going to send a message to our enemies that says that you don't get to walk all over the United States. You don't get to deny our inspection officials access to your facilities. You don't get to violate the terms of your agreement by acquiring too many centrifuges and producing too much heavy water. You don't get to look into missile technology when we specifically said you aren't allowed to do that. And you also don't get to develop nukes with our enemies who also want to blow us up. This is going to tell our enemies that if you want to sit down at the negotiation table of the United States and you violate the terms of that negotiation, we're going to pull out and we're going to punish you for doing so. That's actually going to increase our legitimacy. We're not dealing with a question of, oh, well, why would you want to be engaged in the United States? We're sending a signal to our enemies that says you do not want to mess with us, because we will use the tools of statecraft at our disposal to punish you for violating the agreement that you voluntarily signed. And I'll go ahead and pass the mic.
Okay, so I've got a few points to address. The first thing is that if you actually look into the Foreign Policy Institute stuff, right, like Mark Tone is a spokesman for the State Department, has said on the record that Iran made no efforts to hide its heavy water. And I know it is your opinion that Obama brought it back to make it look like Iran was not complying, but isn't it also just as likely that it is what the State Department says it is, and Iran simply complied with its end of the deal by exporting and selling the heavy water, which was in excess? Like, those are two contrasting opinions. You can think that it's the deep state covering for Iran, but it's a pretty dumb way to do it considering it's in plain sight. It's just far more likely that this is just literally the deal working out as the text of the deal dictates. That if Iran exceeds its limits, that then it takes adequate steps to bring itself back to the limits. And the fact that they have made no effort to hide this as the State Department, and the fact that we all know about it, suggests the deal is working. Second thing, your alternative of sanctions. Okay, there's a number of problems with this. The first is that this isn't about not going into the deal in the first place. This is about pulling out of the deal. The deal has been in place for a number of years now, so you can't simply reapply sanctions for a few key reasons. One, many of the sanctions which Iran held against it were asset freezes. That was when Iran had a lot of money in US banks and had a lot of money in European banks, which we were able to freeze on the spot. That is no longer the case because those assets have since been unfrozen and moved around. So you can't simply refreeze them. So even if you wanted to reapply sanctions, you couldn't. Two, the sanctions effort was not a unilateral US policy. It was actually a policy of the US in cooperation with the EU and Russia and China. And the EU, Russia, and China don't have the same sort of domestic political pressures the US does. They don't want to pull out of the deal because from their perspective, the deal is working exactly as it wants to. The EU also has other vested economic and geopolitical interests in having Iran be unsanctioned. For example, Iran is a crucial competitor for things of natural gas for the like for when the EU gets in tiffs with Russia. Russia's main tool of political power against the EU is to withhold natural gas. Iran provides important counterbalance against that. So you can't simply reapply sanctions because you need the cooperation of actors who do not share the opinion of you. They actually want to stay in the deal. The last thing on sanctions is that the idea that sanctions were preventing nuclear proliferation was wrong. So, for example, all of the restrictions we've talked about, Iran had a huge stockpile of uranium. It had centrifuges. It had a whole lot of enriched uranium. It had a whole huge stockpile of heavy water, despite the fact that we are having sanctions for many, many, many years. Iran can get these nuclear materials even if sanctions are implemented. You've given me no reason to suggest why they haven't. What sanctions were doing against Iran was instead just crippling the poorest in its citizens. It was also restricting us from other legitimate forms of free trade, like the forms of natural gas. So you would need to prove that sanctions are actually linked to access to nuclear materials. You would need to prove that we get the cooperation of actors who have vested interest not to cooperate against us, and you'd have to prove that we can somehow refreeze assets which have since been released. All of those things are impossible.
All right, so let's begin your first argument that Iran just made a mistake. I would be inclined to agree with this if we were negotiating with the nuclear policy of, say, Denmark or Switzerland, a country generally ambivalent to its neighbors. I am not inclined to agree with that argument, since the official foreign policy position of the United States of Iran with regard to the United States is that the United States is literally, quote, great Satan, end quote. This is not a country that loves us or a country that has a compelling interest in international peace us and wants to destroy us. And I do not think it is reasonable for the doubt that they just miscalculated of chemical materials necessary to produce nuclear weapons. I think we have really, really compelling reasons to doubt that. Now, in response to the second argument you made about reapplying the sanctions, you made basically two arguments. The first is that the assets that we had initially frozen have been moved. And the second argument is that there are other countries involved in the deal that don't want to pull out. So let's talk about these assets first. You are correct that there were assets that were frozen that we unfroze as a part of the deal. So my first response is this: the powerful military, financial, cybersecurity, and intelligence force in the world today, bar none. I think it's reasonable that we can find a couple of bank accounts controlled by the Iranian government and freeze those bank accounts. I think that is well within our power to do so. The second response is that we have alternative sanction methods. Even if we can't find those handful of specific bank accounts, as you allege, we have the entire in our State Department at our disposal. And I'm certain that there are a couple research analysts at the State Department that can probably come up with a sanction methodology to prevent Iran from acquiring the materials or the money necessary to continue their nuclear program. Now, in response to this argument that other countries want to pull out, you kind of painted this picture of all these other benevolent countries in the United Nations who are interested in continuing the Iran deal, who believe it succeeds, and yet we see no evidence whatsoever to illustrate that. I don't have any official diplomatic statements from any of those countries. I don't even have a list of the countries you claim that like the deal and believe that it's working. You continue to pose this rhetoric as if everyone deal is working, and you don't have any evidence of that. I actually have really clear-cut evidence from the people who are supposed to be enforcing this deal that says that, yeah, Iran actually has not complied with this at all. Your last argument is that the sanctions are just going to hurt the poor people in Iran. I just want to be clear. You don't make nuclear weapons out of rice and beans. I don't think we're talking about putting sanctions or paper wrappers. We're talking about sanctioning the revenue that the Iranian government generates. We're talking about sanctioning who they can and cannot do trade with. We're talking about applying sanctions them that are going to make it difficult, if not impossible, for them to run a nuclear weapons program. I think that this analysis that we're just going to hurt the poor in Iran is a bit far-fetched at best.
So a quick comparison on this stuff about the heavy water. So I don't have to prove that Iran's intentions were innocent, even if their intentions were 100% guilty, right? And they definitely tried to exceed the heavy water. You still admit that the inspectors caught this and they since offloaded the water. What would happen to the water under your side of the house?
Under the water, we would be able to sanction Iran such that they are incapable of producing heavy water.
Okay, so you don't contest that the deal was actually effective in removing the water. You have just staked all of your case on the sanctions' ability to block them from getting that water in the first place.
I just want to be clear. It's obvious the deal was ineffective because the deal was incapable of preventing them from continuing their nuclear development program, and so we need to pull out and try something else. I think that's been proven beyond reasonable doubt at this point.
Okay, so you deny that the water was sold to Obama because earlier you said that Iran had the water and then they sold it back. So is that no longer true?
No, my position is that Obama bought the water back to cover to make it look like the deal was successful. That's my position.
Okay, so but I know that's your opinion on what happened, but regardless of why the water was bought back, it was bought back, which means that the deal has worked. When Iran exceeded its limits, it was caught via inspection, and then the limits were maintained. Your alternative is reliant on the sanctions working. So let's have a few. I think this is where your analysis gets quite weak, to be honest. You said, well, the US is really big, so I'm sure we can, quote, find a few bank accounts to freeze. In order to prevent things like nuclear proliferation, you need more than a couple of bank accounts. You need a worldwide joint effort on the selling of any nuclear arms from anyone, which you're not going to get. You said, well, I'm sure we can come up with a few strategies. Well, why weren't you able to come up with the strategies before? Sanctions against Iran were tried before, and they had all of this heavy water, and they had all of the nuclear weapons. So were we off the mark that time? What's going to change this time? You said I have no evidence of the EU. Just look up. EU threatens to block sanctions in US showdown. The EU has made it abundantly clear that they will not only not cooperate with sanctions, that they will actively try to scuttle and undermine our ability to make sanctions because they think that the deal is good. So what I'll ask you is this. Why is it that the EU will change their mind when you pull out? And secondly, if the sanctions were able to prevent them from getting nuclear materials, why didn't that work the first time? Because we had sanctions on Iran for a long time and they were still able to get a lot of nuclear materials.
Okay, so a couple of things I want to clarify. The first thing I want to clarify is that my position is twofold. I want to pull out of the current deal and I want to place the United States in a position where it could renegotiate. It's not my job to defend Obama-era sanctions that are pre-Iran nuclear deal. And it's also not my job to defend the European Union or its positions on this in any way, shape, or form. I don't care what the European Union thinks. That's not my job. My job is to demonstrate why the United States needs to pull out of the nuclear deal, and I've given you compelling reasons for that. It is blatantly obvious from the evidence that I've presented that Iran is not cooperating. And the Obama administration has actually allowed Iran to walk all over it, despite that there's clear evidence that Iran's not doing what they were supposed to. The Obama administration allowed them to continue their nuclear weapons proliferation program. That's a problem. And we need to do something about that. And what we need to do is we need to begin by getting out of the Iran nuclear deal, because the deal is not working. It's not accomplishing its intended purpose. And that's going to bring about a couple of advantages. But I just want to point out for the judges, so far from my opponent, we haven't seen any compelling evidence other than the single example of the heavy water. His opinion is that the heavy water is an example of the deal working. That is the only evidence we have from my opponent that the deal has ever worked. I would counter that with the 4 pieces of evidence I gave in my first speech. I'm going to post links to that after the debate that illustrate that it's not working. They have produced more heavy water than they were supposed to several times. They're requiring more centrifuges than they were supposed to. And oh, by the way, this has also been ignored by my opponent, generally speaking. They're also cooperating with North Korea and assisting North Korea in its development of nuclear weapons. This is clear evidence that not only does Iran not complying with the treaty, but they're very clearly still intent on developing nuclear weapons to put them into a position to attack the United States. So it's obvious that the deal is failing. It's obvious that we need to pull out. What we do beyond pulling out isn't necessary for the affirmative to prove. We can renegotiate, or we can just sanction them like we did before, try something different. That's not my job. My job here today is to illustrate that the deal is failing and that we need to get out of it, and I think I've done so.
just to clarify what is and what isn't your job, obviously no deal is ever perfect in geopolitics, right? There's always compromise. It is your job to show that you can make things better, right? So my question to you is, why is it that since sanctions were unable to do the things that you wanted them to do last time when you had the cooperation of the international community, why is it that sanctions without that cooperation will suddenly be able to restrict Iran in ways which they were never able to before?
I don't know what the sanctions were, and it's not my job to defend all sanctions. My position is that the deal is failing, and we need to pull out and try something different. Sanctions could be one of those options, but it's not my job to tell you what those sanctions would be. All I have to do is prove the resolution is true.
Okay, so in theory, even if, in your opinion, even if the thing you were trying, which is different, makes everything worse, you would still win just because the deal isn't perfect?
No, just we need to pull out of the nuclear deal, which means I need to show that the deal is really, really bad and that there are some compelling reasons as to why we should pull out, and I gave you those in my first speech.
You also then need to prove that the alternative is better than staying in the deal, because yes, it is, because otherwise it is okay. I need to get a clear equivocal statement on this. So you believe that even if everything gets worse when we pull out of the deal, just because the deal isn't perfect, you still think you win the debate? That's what you think?
That is a gross misrepresentation of my position, and I want to go ahead and clarify this in my voting issues. I'm going to talk about two things. I want to begin with the affirmative burden, and then we're going to look at why the deal is failing. The only thing I have to do to win this round is to prove the resolution is true. All I have to do is demonstrate that we should pull out of the nuclear deal, and I've done that in two ways. The first is by demonstrating that the deal is a failure, with numerous evidence illustrating that Iran is not cooperating, that they hate us, and they want to kill us. I think that's been proven. That's kicking a dead horse at this point. The second thing that I must prove is to prove that there are good reasons to actually do that. And the reasons are as follows. Like I said in my first speech, we're going to send a message to our enemies around the world. We're going to store leverage against Iran, and we're going to protect our interests internationally. Those are compelling reasons as to why we should pull out. The deal is a failure. We have to pull out. No deal would be better than the deal that we currently have. And without a deal, this gives us opportunities to try something different that will work.
Okay, so let me first of all start with the first thing in this debate. It is not enough for my opponent just to say that the deal isn't working 100% perfectly, because no deal ever is. It is the nature of geopolitics, when you have actors with opposed interests, that there is always compromise. What he needs to prove is that the alternative is better than having the deal. So let me first divide his examples into the deal not working into one. Examples of the deal working. For example, Iran's centrifuges and heavy water abuse have been discovered by our inspections. That is how he knows about them. Without the deal, we wouldn't know about those things. In fact, the centrifuges would go unchecked, the heavy water stockpiles would still increase, and Iran would be more able to get a nuke. Because of the deal, we know about those things, and as he conceded, they have been forced by one way or another to offload those limits. Without the deal, we wouldn't have those things. The second problems he had was stuff which wasn't in the deal. Stuff like cooperation with North Korea, stuff about the moral character of Iran. Look, obviously, it is regrettable that Iran has cooperated with North Korea, but they would do that without the deal anyway. They would do that even if you were imposing sanctions on them. In fact, when you sanction all of Iran's trade with the West, that actually forces them to trade with other actors like North Korea even more. So that sort of cooperation is likely to increase under sanctions, not decrease. The other piece of evidence I have as to why they're complying with the deal is that, one, the US Congress itself has ratified every single check that they have complied with the deal, and two, the International Atomic Energy Agency says they're complying. Look it up. Just look up, is Iran complying with the deal? Look at all the headlines. It says that they are. Then his next thing he has to prove is that the sanctions that he is able to put in will prevent Iran from even getting the stuff in the first place. The first thing I point out is that sanctions have been tried with overwhelming force, persistence, and cooperation with the international community in the past, and they were not able to do that. He has given you no specific reason other than we will try something new as to why they will be able to work this time. I have suggested that the fact that Iran's assets have already been released, the fact that the EU has actively said that they will try and disrupt and scuttle any sanctions we impose, suggests that actually the sanctions will come back with less teeth, less efficacy, and will not be able to restrict the ability of Iran to access nuclear materials. He had to do way more to show that, and that is crucial and deadly for his case. If he cannot prove to you sanctions will do the things he says they do, then even an imperfect deal is good, because everything simply gets worse under his side. Lastly, another external threat: US legitimacy. He says that it shows the US is getting tough and shows that it will not, hold for
other actors messing with deals. That depends on the perceptions of the deal, right? If the deal is perceived to be being agreed with, then that legitimacy goes backwards. He needs the world to agree that Iran was messing with the deal. And the world doesn't agree. The EU has already stated that they think the deal is going well. So is Russia and China. Look it up from sources like Reuters, for example, quite reputable. The fact that the US internally in its own Congress has said and legislated and voted that Iran has complied with the deal makes the US look like a hypocrite. At the end of the day, the US will be unable to effectively negotiate any other forms of